Welcome to the Electrification Pledge proposal. This is a transition plan to move away from fossil fuel machines to electric machines to reduce emissions, global warming, and the increasing effects of climate change. My name is Tom Coleman. I'm from the Climate Reality Project's Chicago Metro chapter. This is part 6. It really brings things together in whether we're going to make a pledge towards electrification or are we going to stay with fossil fuel, make a pledge to the fossil fuel companies. Every time we buy a device, a machine, it's either going to be an electric machine or it's going to be a fossil fuel machine. So that's a decision that we talk about in this presentation. Part 7 is a wrap-up, a very short wrap-up of everything. So in this presentation, we'll talk about the emissions reminder. We haven't talked about that since the first presentation. We'll do a very brief recap on that. Emission sources, solution overview. Can I change the world? The electrification pledge itself, to-do list, reminder on incentives, and finally the conclusion. So back in the first presentation that we did, we looked at this chart right here and we said our historical emissions are gigantic in terms of rising over time here to about 51 or 52 gigatons, which a gigaton, as a reminder, is a billion tons. So 51 billion metric tons is what we're talking about in terms of emissions. Take that and multiply it times 2,200, and you get a sense of the astronomical amount of emissions that we're putting into our atmosphere every day in our oceans as well. Now, in 2012, we agreed, countries around the world agreed that, we really need to try and cut emissions about in half by 2030, and then to be net zero by 2050, as you can see in the second vertical line, net zero, which says that we're not exactly zero emissions, but we are capturing certain emissions with trees and other technologies in order to be the equivalent of net zero. So that was the objective. We are here at the beginning of 2024. We should have dropped like this. We didn't. And this is our challenge, to be here in order to be able to keep consistent at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are currently have risen to about 1.1 to 1.2 Celsius already, and we've actually hit 1.5 for something like 80 days in a row last year. So that doesn't mean we're steady state 1.5, but it does say that it's a leading indicator that we're starting to hit that target already. You can see by the challenges here, the worst case policies and actions really doesn't look like we're going to get anywhere at all. And therefore, the rise in temperature to almost 3 degrees Celsius or 5.2 degrees is pretty significant. And when we look at how that affects the Arctic, numbers would be double or triple that number as you look at different parts of the world, because this is, of course, a global average. And then you say that targets for 2030, the pledges and targets that we have now, and then the optimistic scenario gets us down to about just under 1.8 degrees, about 1.8 degrees Celsius. So that's just a wrap up. I wanted you to remind you of this because the severity of the gap between these things. So we really have to say this is an emergency. So what is it we should do to deal with the emergency? So I'll remind you that most of the emissions coming from these fossil fuel plants, whether it's a gas plant, a coal plant, or an oil refinery, about 10% of the emissions are coming from these facilities, and the 90% of the emission comes from the products we use when we buy the products from the fossil fuel companies. So it'd be the gasoline produced here from oil that would be then burned in our cars over the next, say, 10 or 12 years or 15 years. It would be the natural gas produced over here and fracked and drilled that would be produced to heat our homes and our water in our homes, and maybe run the clothes dryer as well. So, and also the same thing in our buildings, heating our buildings and our places of worship. So the 90%. So in order to be able to cut off, we have to say, will the 10% companies, will the fossil fuel companies suddenly turn over a leaf and start selling us green products that are clean? Well, so far they haven't done that, and their investments are really quite poor. But they are trying to reduce their own 10% of emissions. in what they call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But it really doesn't help us if we continue to buy their products, because most of the emissions come from burning their products over here in the right side. So with that, we want to move on. The cost of climate change will be 5 trillion to 10 trillion, as mentioned in a previous presentation. Whether we do something about climate change or not, we will spend this money anyway. The question is, where will we spend it? Will we spend it on mitigation to try and avoid the escalating problem that we have? Or will we spend it on adaptation for, say, ways to protect the cities from ocean flooding and high tides and so forth, and damages because of hurricanes and tornadoes? Right now, we're spending massive amounts of money for adaptation and for damages, and not near enough mitigation. But as time goes on, if we don't do mitigation, we will be all our money will be in adaptation and crime and damages, and we won't be really solving the problem, which is a bad place to be. So I think Ray Dalio really had a lot of good things to say about where the fact is we're going to spend our money anyway. So as a reminder, 75% of the emissions come from these areas. And we've talked about each one of these areas here, and 42% of the decisions are yours to make for our 253 million vehicles, 140 million buildings. The transition we require is to go from the left, the fossil fuel machines, to the right, to the clean electric machines. To do this, we have to ask the question, can I change the world? Is it worth me doing something? Well, right now you are changing the world. Families are contributing right now 48 metric tons on average, or 105,821 pounds of emissions right now themselves. So you're already changing the world. And they're in the United States is something like 320 million people. Each of those is 16 metric tons. So you can see how it really starts to add up. So we're already changing the world by the things we do in our families, how we drive, and things like that. So number two would be what do we do individually can influence our community. So as we make changes in number one, to reduce our emissions and to reduce our spending, by the way, or save a ton of money by moving to electric machines. What we do individually, if we share this, influences our community, and it influences the businesses we buy things from in the supply chain, because we don't want to buy those things anymore. It's a ripple effect that can be strong, especially with social media today and communications with our family and friends. And Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So this ripple effect, we want it, and we want it to be big. So as a reminder, these committed emissions are the emissions from the fossil fuel companies over the lifetime of the machines that we buy. So while I did share this before, I wanted to emphasize here, by buying the fossil fuel machines, we're making a fossil fuel pledge. We're pledging to Exxon. We're pledging to Prairie State Energy Campus. We're pledging to the fossil fuel, the oil and gas companies. We're pledging to continue to buy their dirty products by buying machines that use their products. So with the electrification pledge that we talked about in previous presentations, we're talking about stopping the pledge, making a commitment for the electrification pledge instead, and moving away from the fossil fuel pledge gradually and carefully over time. So the electrification pledge looks like this. It says, as my home and appliances and vehicles reach the end of their useful life, I pledge to be ready to replace them with electric alternatives and to encourage my family, friends, and community to do the same. Now, the key phrase here that I underlines is a pledge to be ready, because when your water heater breaks, the first thing you're probably going to do is it could flood the basement, or it could just plain stop working. You're going to call up the contractor or the plumber, and you're going to say, hey, fix my water heater or give me a new one. Now, the give me a new one is the issue here. Will you be ready? Do you know the age of that machine, and will you be ready to go to the heat pump water heater when that water heater breaks? Could be a year from now, but will you be ready? Have you started to plan and figure out where you need to be? That's what the pledge is about, being ready. It doesn't mean you replace all these machines overnight, go to heat pumps instantly or EVs. it means you're going to pledge to be ready to do this, and you will gradually plan that out. And if you're an activist in Climate Reality or Sierra Club or wherever you are, you will say, well, I will encourage my municipal elected officials and staff to provide information on federal, state, and local incentives on their website and at community events and out sport informing businesses and institutions and places of worship and libraries on the benefits and incentives for electrification. So that's really the commitment here. And to put some teeth behind that, here's a suggested to-do list of what you might do. First, list your 5 fossil fuel machines: your cars, the heating and air conditioning system, the water heater you have, the clothes dryer you have, and the stove that you have. Make a list. How old are these machines? Pretty easy to find out how old those machines are based on your receipts or even on the device itself. Sequence the list by items closest to the end of life. We can help you at Climate Reality, but as a basic rule, these machines last 10 to 15 years, right? So some a little bit more, some a little bit less, some are 8 years. But as a rule of thumb, about 10 years or so, 8 to 10 years, maybe 15 years. So sequence them close to end of life. What's the oldest thing that hasn't been replaced yet that's a fossil fuel machine? Number 4 would be, what's the most important thing that you could do? Are any of the fossil fuel machines in need of replacement now or soon? Should you or can you go to rooftop solar so that any electrification you do will be more or less free, not just for your home, but for your car? And or if you can't do that, maybe it's community solar, as talked about in that presentation. Do you need a home energy audit? There are companies that do this that can help you find out where the heat's going, where is the waste going. It might be that you need to do some insulation before you put the new heat pump in, so that you don't have to buy as big a heat pump. But anyway, it's an option to consider. You should check with your tax preparer about rebates and tax credits, what it all means. A tax credit is your money, by the way. Some people think it's some kind of rebate. There are rebates, but tax credit's your money that you're not paying the federal government, so that you can use that money instead to buy a car, an electric vehicle, for example. So it's really a conservative way to take the money you would ordinarily give to the federal government and use it for a good cause. And that's the principle. And it's not just electric vehicles that we're talking about. Tax credits are used throughout the industry throughout the country, without regard to which a political party is. Decide your next most important move. There's no perfect answer, but clean electricity in your car may be a priority. Beware of traditional car dealers. Car dealers want to sell cars that require a lot of maintenance. They want to do the oil change. They want to replace the spark plugs and do the tune-up. They want to replace the antifreeze in your car. They want to flush the automatic transmission periodically. They want to replace the worn out belts on the engine. They want to tune up that transmission. You see, the electric car has none of those things. So consequently, even car dealers that sell EVs, they'll sell you an EV if you insist, but they'd much rather, sell you a story about why you shouldn't buy one and you should buy the gas car instead. So you need to be aware of that. And so be aware, we have a team of experts on things like electric cars. Now, when it comes to plumbers and contractors, some of them may not have any knowledge about the electrification experience. I talked to our contractor recently, and they are ready to do our heat pump, water heater, right away. They're on board, okay? But they weren't on board several years ago about things like that. So it's good to see them do that. If needed, touch base with Climate Reality experts for advice on what you might be able to, contacts that you need to make, experts that have done these things already. So I wanted to share our family transition. And it's what I did. It's not necessarily the best thing. I've made mistakes, but here's the way it is. So we started replacing light bulbs in 2015, 12%. If you haven't done it, consider it. In 2018, we made the decision that electric vehicles are finally ready for prime time. They were not ready in our view, unless you had very, very expensive ones before 2018. But in 2018, they were ready, and we bought our first one, and we never looked back. We bought our second one in 2019, and since then, we bought a couple more to replace the original ones we got. We did rooftop solar in 2020. We did our electric lawnmower in 2021, electric snowblower in 2022, electric induction stove in 2023. And over the years, to support those things, we did insulation, new windows, new doors, and new skylights. So that's the things we did. You may want to do it in different order, but it's an example of the projects that are done. You may have a lot of good things that you've done. Now, on the plan side, this is the projects that are not done. So the first thing is we took a look at the lifetime, we took a look at our machines not done. And our Maytag methane clothes dryer was installed in 2008, 16 years old. And the lifetime of these machines is 10 to 13 years. So we're really kind of on borrowed time on that. So that's now on the list. That heat pump clothes dryer is on the list for replacement in early 2024. Number two is our 6-year-old A.O. Smith methane gas water heater. They typically last 8 to 12 years, is still running pretty well. Our plumber said it's still working okay. There's some evidence of age there, but it might be good for a couple more years. So we're not going to do this probably in 2024. We may in late 24 or 25, but we're probably not going to wait 8 years or 12 years to do it because it's gas. And number three, unfortunately, we did number three and number four 2 years ago. And we tried to talk our installer, T.R. Miller was our heating and air conditioning company. We tried to get them to sell us heat pump heating and air conditioning. We knew about them, but they convinced us that heat pumps were not ready for prime time 2 years ago. Now, that may or may not be true, but they're ready for prime time now. They weren't, according to them, they weren't back then. So unfortunately, though, we installed new heating and air conditioning systems in 2021, so they're only 2 years old. The good news is they're pretty efficient heaters and air conditioners, very efficient, in fact. The bad news is they're only 2 years old, and these things last 15 to 20 years. Our last one lasted about 10, I think it was 10 or 11 years. So even if we, targeted 12 years, we got a long way to go on those. So unless we have plenty of money to burn, we're not going to do that, anytime soon. So that's the kind of decisions that we had to make. Maybe you want to make a list, and it's not really too complicated to see the types of things you need to do. Now, we previously covered rebates and tax credits in the previous session. So you want to go back to those previous sessions where I talked about the detail of these. I'm only including them here as a reminder on rebates that are available at the link you see at the bottom of the page for the devices that we talked about. I'm reminding you here of the tax credits at the link at the bottom of the page for rebates for things like electric vehicles and heat pump water heaters. And that's really in conclusion. So I know I skipped over it a lot because we spent time already on that. So the conclusion of the pledge is 97% of climate scientists in peer-reviewed studies are saying that, and top organizations are saying that a certain amount of global heating and climate change are real, and that it's anthropogenic. And so it's a serious type of situation. They're certain of this, not a certain amount. I may have said it wrong. They're certain that it's global heating and it's real, and we're responsible for this. Finally, replacing fossil fuel polluting machines with clean electric machines represents the top solution to significantly reduce emissions and eventually reduce the impact of increasing climate crisis. We have 75% of the solutions now that we need to collapse the fossil fuel emissions and drive them out of our homes and vehicles. 42% of the decisions to replace these polluting machines are yours to make at your kitchen table. And finally, by taking Electrification Pledge, you agree to learn about clean solutions, gain knowledge about the changes needed in your home and vehicles, and gradually replace fossil polluting machines with clean machines. In a sense, by taking the electrification pledge, you're rejecting the fossil fuel pledge that many of us had taken because we thought we had to. Well, we don't have to anymore. And so therefore, as we want to replace, as it's time to replace machines, we want to go away from the fossil fuel pledge to the electrification pledge. So it's our choice. Do we want to stay with the left side where we waste the sun's energy and do nothing with it and depend on the fossil fuel companies and make a pledge to them? Or do we want to move to the right and put the sun's energy to work on our roofs and our solar farms, in our homes and in our vehicles? So the key references are here for you, as in the previous presentations. We're now concluding the electrification pledge proposal. There is a very brief summary in point 7. Thank you very much. We hope that you can commit to the electrification pledge and be the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.